July 1944. The Pacific Ocean nightfall sinks over a restless sea. Waves roll beneath a moon half hidden by clouds. In the darkness, a faint wake cuts across the surface. The USS Seahorse, one of America's silent hunters. Inside, the red glow of control lights paints the faces of men who have not seen daylight in weeks. The air is stale, heavy with oil and sweat, but no one speaks above a whisper. At periscope depth, Commander Slade cutter peers through the eyepiece. His target, a convoy of Japanese freighters, escorted by 2 destroyers, hauling the Empire's last precious barrels of crude oil from Borneo to Yokohama. He lowers his voice. Fire 1, fire 2, a dull hiss. Then silence. Moments later, 2 white flashes bloom across the horizon. Shockwaves roll through the hull. The men exhale as plumes of fire erupt across the sea. The convoy is breaking apart. In less than 10 minutes, the ocean swallows another fragment of Japan's supply fleet, a loss it can no longer afford to replace. That night, somewhere in Tokyo, Imperial Navy officers would receive another grim report. The Americans had found their lifeline and were cutting it faster than Japan could rebuild. By 1941, the Empire of Japan stood on the edge of industrial overreach. Its war machine stretched from the coasts of China to the jungles of Malaya, demanding fuel, steel, and food that the home islands could not produce on their own. Every ship, every plane, every bullet depended on a fragile chain of transport ships crossing vast stretches of ocean. From the southern resource zones, Borneo, Sumatra, the Dutch East Indies, convoys of merchant vessels carried crude oil, rubber, tin, and bauxite northward to feed Japan's factories. Without them, the nation's industry would suffocate. Yet the Imperial Navy, focused on grand surface battles and fleet prestige, had never prepared to defend the lifeline that sustained its empire. In the early years of the Pacific War, Japanese planners believed control of the skies and surface fleets would keep those routes safe. They built powerful battleships and swift carriers, but invested little in anti-submarine warfare, escort vessels, or convoy tactics. Most merchant ships sailed with minimal protection, trusting speed and distance to carry them through. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy's submarine force, though small, waited for its chance. Operating from bases at Pearl Harbor, Fremantle, and Midway, American submariners called themselves the Silent Service. Their mission, to strangle Japan's maritime supply arteries until its war economy collapsed. But in 1942, that mission faltered. Early U.S. torpedoes, the Mark 14 and its magnetic detonator, were plagued with malfunctions. They ran too deep, failed to explode, or detonated prematurely. American skippers risked their lives only to watch their torpedoes bounce harmlessly off enemy hulls. Commanders filed complaint after complaint, but bureaucracy and disbelief slowed the fix. At the same time, restrictive orders limited their targets. Washington initially prohibited attacks on certain merchant vessels and required complex identification protocols that allowed Japanese convoys to slip away. For the first year of war, U.S. submarines achieved little more than isolated victories. Yet beneath the surface, lessons were being learned. Hard, costly lessons. Each failed patrol sharpened tactics. Each near miss revealed flaws in weapons and doctrine. Slowly, experience began to replace theory. By mid-1943, change was coming. The torpedo problems were being solved, new radar systems were arriving, and aggressive commanders were taking control of the submarine force. The Americans were no longer content to chase scattered targets. They were preparing to hunt systematically, to blockade the empire itself. The Pacific was about to become a killing ground for Japanese shipping, not through massive fleets or carrier duels, but through patient, relentless warfare waged from the depths. By late 1943, the the U.S. submarine campaign began to transform from frustration into methodical destruction. The key architect behind this change was Rear Admiral Charles A. Lockwood, commander of the Pacific Fleet's submarines. Calm, analytical, and fiercely loyal to his crews, Lockwood understood that victory beneath the waves required freedom of action, reliable weapons, and ruthless efficiency. His first order of business was to fix the torpedoes, after months of field tests, often conducted in secret. Against the resistance of Washington's Bureau of Ordnance, Lockwood's men proved that the Mark 14's depth, settings, and magnetic triggers were fatally flawed. By mid-1943, mechanical exploders replaced the magnetic type. Depth settings were recalibrated, and the U.S. submarine fleet finally had a weapon it could trust. At the same time, new radar and sonar technologies began reshaping night operations. The SJ surface search radar allowed submarines to detect ships far beyond visual range, even through fog or darkness. This gave American boats a decisive edge. They could stalk convoys, attack at night, and vanish before Japanese escorts could respond. Equally vital was a change in command philosophy. Lockwood empowered his captains to take initiative, to attack aggressively, and to disregard outdated restrictions. Men like Dudley Mush Morton of the Wahoo, Richard O'Kane of the Tang, and Eugene Fluckey of the Barb embodied this new breed. Audacious, inventive, and relentless, they turned submarines from defensive patrols into offensive strike weapons. Meanwhile, Japan's vulnerabilities were growing. Its merchant fleet, about 6 million tons at the start of the war, was never designed for the scale of the empire it had created. Replacement rates lagged far behind losses, and shipyards lacked both materials and manpower to keep pace. The Imperial Navy's obsession with capital ships left merchant protection an afterthought. As American submarines gained experience, they began coordinating patrol zones, sharing intelligence, and using code-breaking data from the Allies' magic intercepts. For the first time, submarines could be vectored toward known convoys, ambushing them along predictable routes through the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and the Philippine waters. By 1944, the U.S. Navy was sinking Japanese ships faster than Tokyo could launch new ones. The numbers were staggering. Hundreds of transports and tankers destroyed each month. Japan's oil imports dropped to a fraction of their pre-war levels. Each sinking was more than a victory at sea. It was a blow to Japan's factories, its aircraft, its fuel reserves, its army's mobility. The empire that had seemed unstoppable in 1941 was now bleeding silently, one convoy at a time. The stage was set for a campaign of attrition unlike any other. A war waged through silence, patience, and precision. The U.S. submarine offensive was never about sheer numbers. It was about technological precision and tactical adaptation. While Japan built its navy around massive surface engagements, the Americans quietly invested in innovations that would redefine undersea warfare. The introduction of radar and sonar integration on submarines like the Tang and Flasher allowed crews to track convoys long before contact. Using the SJ radar, submarines could detect a Japanese freighter from over 8 miles away, often before the enemy even realized danger was near. At night, they surfaced to attack, using radar bearings instead of moonlight, and slipped away before destroyers could triangulate their position. Then came torpedo evolution. Once the Mark 14's defects were corrected, U.S. submarines became devastatingly efficient. The steam-driven torpedoes, armed with contact exploders, could pierce a freighter's hull and detonate beneath the keel, snapping the ship's spine in seconds. By 1944, the new Mark 18 electric torpedo, silent and wakeless, made detection nearly impossible. Japanese lookouts, trained to spot the telltale white wakes, found themselves blind against invisible weapons. But technology alone wasn't enough. American tactics evolved faster than Japan's countermeasures. Submarines began operating in wolf packs, coordinated through encrypted radio and intelligence reports. 3 or 4 boats would patrol a single shipping lane, encircling convoys with surgical precision. When radar contact was made, the lead boat struck first, forcing Japanese escorts to scatter, only for the others to close in and finish the job. Every success compounded Japan's logistical crisis. Each sunken tanker meant less fuel for aircraft and ships. Each freighter lost meant fewer supplies for soldiers stranded across the Pacific. By 1944, Japan's armies in Burma and the Philippines were already suffering starvation and fuel shortages directly caused by these submarine attacks. U.S. submariners refined their art with mechanical discipline. Periscope bearings, attack angles, and depth settings were calculated with the precision of engineers and the instincts of hunters. What began as a flawed force plagued by malfunctioning weapons had evolved into the most efficient maritime blockade in modern history. For Japan, the ocean that once connected its empire had turned against it. Every route was watched, every harbor threatened, and every voyage carried the risk of vanishing without a trace beneath the waves. The Americans had turned the Pacific, vast, open, and once thought unconquerable, into a silent trap. Beneath the machinery and tactics, the war under the Pacific waves was also a story of men, their endurance, fear, and ingenuity. The U.S. submarine crews lived in steel tubes barely 300 feet long, surrounded by darkness and pressure. Patrols often lasted 70 days or more. Temperatures rose above 100 degrees in the engine room. The air was thick with diesel fumes, sweat, and tension. Yet morale remained astonishingly high. Admiral Lockwood understood why. His commanders were not driven by fame or ceremony, but by autonomy, a rare commodity in military life. Each submarine was a self-contained world, commanded by a single man whose judgment could mean survival or destruction. Captains like Eugene Fluckey of the USS Barb embodied this independence. Fluckey once surfaced under the cover of night to fire torpedoes at anchored ships in a harbor, then escaped at full speed through shallow, mined waters. It was a maneuver that broke every rule, yet won him the Medal of Honor. This courage was mirrored in the precision of men like Commander Richard O'Kane of the USS Tang. His crew became legendary for their teamwork, silent coordination, split-second reactions, and unspoken trust. Inside a submarine, noise meant death. Every valve turn, every whisper was measured. The pressure of silence forged a bond that no surface ship could replicate. On the Japanese side, disbelief turned to dread. Merchant captains, once confident in open ocean runs, began sailing zigzag courses, extinguishing lights, and praying for cloudy nights. Convoy escorts dropped depth charges blindly, often wasting ammunition on phantom contacts. The Imperial Navy attempted to introduce convoy systems and specialized escorts, but by the time these changes reached scale, too few ships remained to protect. Psychologically, the impact was devastating. Japanese soldiers stranded in the Philippines or New Guinea wrote in diaries that supplies never came. Ships simply disappeared. Factories in Osaka and Yokohama slowed to a crawl as imported raw materials dwindled. Pilots at training schools received only minutes of flight time because there was no fuel to spare. In every sense, the American submariners were unseen executioners of Japan's war machine. They did not fight for headlines or glory. Their victories were silent, recorded only in tonnage sunk and coordinates marked on charts. By 1944, this silent war beneath the waves had become one of the deadliest and most decisive campaigns of World War II. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific's balance of power had shifted beneath the surface. U.S. submarines, barely 2% of the Navy's total personnel, were now sinking over half of all Japanese ships destroyed at sea. The campaign had evolved from opportunistic strikes into a coordinated economic siege. Convoys leaving the Dutch East Indies or Singapore rarely reached Japan intact. The USS Tang, USS Flasher, USS Barb, and USS Harder patrolled key choke points, the Luzon Strait, the South China Sea, and the approaches to Formosa. Here, shipping lanes converged into narrow corridors, forcing Japan's vessels into predictable routes. For submarine commanders, it was a hunter's paradise. In July 1944, the USS Flasher, under Commander Reuben T. Whitaker, detected a major convoy south of the China coast, tankers loaded with oil for the Japanese fleet. Using radar at night, the Flasher tracked the convoy for hours before striking from within its center. In less than 30 minutes, Whitaker's torpedoes destroyed 3 tankers and a freighter, igniting a wall of fire across the sea. The glow was visible for 50 miles. Similar scenes unfolded across the Pacific. In September, Commander Slade cutter aboard the USS Seahorse ambushed a heavily escorted convoy near Luzon, sinking 4 transports in a single day. Depth charges rained down for hours, shaking the submarine so violently that crewmen bled from their noses and ears. Yet the Seahorse slipped away unharmed. The results were catastrophic for Japan. In just 6 months of 1944, American submarines sank nearly 1.5 million tons of shipping, more than the Imperial Navy could hope to replace in years. Oil reserves began to evaporate. Tankers that once fueled Japan's carriers and destroyers were burning on the ocean surface. Tokyo's naval command realized too late that the empire's arteries had been severed. The once proud combined fleet, which had dreamed of decisive surface battles, now sat immobilized in harbors, starved of fuel, unable to maneuver. The Pacific, once a theater of giant clashes and fleet engagements, had become a silent battlefield ruled by unseen predators. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Only the speed of Japan's collapse remained uncertain. Yet even as the Americans perfected their blockade, the Japanese tried desperately to fight back, deploying convoys and escorts in a last attempt to save what remained of their merchant fleet. Desperation forced the Imperial Japanese Navy to change tactics. In late 1944, Tokyo ordered the creation of organized convoy systems, drawing lessons from the Allies' own Atlantic experience. Merchant ships were grouped together and assigned escorts, destroyers, corvettes, even converted fishing trawlers armed with depth charges. The plan was sound in theory, but Japan faced a grim reality. There were too few ships left to protect, and too few escorts to defend them. The Americans had already mapped Japan's maritime lifelines. Intelligence teams at Pearl Harbor and Brisbane, aided by Allied codebreakers, intercepted Japanese radio traffic and plotted convoy routes with precision. Submarines were deployed like chess pieces, positioned at every choke point. The Bashi Channel, the South China Sea, the Formosa Strait. Once a convoy entered these killing zones, escape was almost impossible. The Japanese countered with depth charges and sonar-equipped escorts, but their technology lagged years behind. Their sonar systems were crude, their radar nearly useless in rough weather, and their crews poorly trained for anti-submarine warfare. American captains quickly learned to exploit these weaknesses, diving deeper than Japanese sonar could reach, firing from extreme angles, or attacking from beneath thermal layers that masked their position. One battle in particular symbolized the futility of Japan's defenses. In December 1944, during the convoy battles off Luzon, 6 American submarines, USS Redfish, USS Spadefish, USS Sea Devil, USS Place, USS Hackleback, and USS Basugo, coordinated an assault that annihilated an entire supply group bound for Manila. More than 20 merchant ships were sent to the bottom. The Japanese escorts fought back with over 800 depth charges, but failed to hit a single submarine. By early 1945, the results were irreversible. Japan's merchant fleet, which once numbered over 6,000 ships, had been reduced to barely 1,000. Of those, many were damaged, laid up, or trapped in port for lack of fuel. Industrial centers like Kobe and Nagoya could no longer receive vital materials from the south. Trains stood idle for want of coal. Aircraft engines rusted for lack of lubricants. Even the Imperial Navy's most powerful battleships, Yamato and Musashi, sat nearly motionless in harbor, their immense guns useless without fuel to move them. When the U.S. fleet advanced toward Okinawa and the Philippines, Japan could not respond. Its ocean lifelines had been severed, its empire suffocating from within. The submarine blockade was complete, and Japan's surrender had already begun, long before the atomic bombs fell. When 1945 began, the Pacific no longer belonged to Japan. The ocean that had once carried its empire's lifeblood was now a graveyard of sunken steel. For every new ship Japan launched, 3 more vanished beneath the waves. The statistics told the story with chilling simplicity. By war's end, American submarines had destroyed over 2,300 Japanese merchant ships and roughly 200 naval vessels, totaling more than 5 million tons of shipping. The effects rippled through every level of Japan's war machine. Refineries in Palembang and Balikpapan kept producing oil, but there were no tankers left to bring it home. Food shipments from Southeast Asia were lost, leaving civilians in the home islands to face rationing and starvation. Rice rations dropped to less than half a pound per person per day. Factories that once produced Zero fighters and torpedoes now stood idle for want of materials. Aluminum imports fell to almost zero, forcing aircraft designers to use wood in construction. Steel production collapsed by nearly 80%. Even Japan's vaunted aircraft carriers, pride of the Imperial Navy, became hollow symbols, unable to leave port, their decks empty, their crews waiting for fuel that would never come. On land, the consequences were visible in the eyes of soldiers and civilians alike. Japanese troops in New Guinea and the Philippines starved in the jungle, cut off from supplies. Diaries recovered after the war spoke of entire units reduced to foraging and cannibalism. "The ships no longer come," one officer wrote. "The sea belongs to the enemy." For the Americans, the silent war had achieved what no bombing campaign could: economic paralysis. Without raw materials, Japan's military engine stalled. Without fuel, its fleet was immobilized. Without food, its people began to lose the will to fight. Yet amid this devastation, the men who had waged the war beneath the sea remained largely unseen. Ghosts of victory who surfaced only to resupply, then vanished again into the depths. In the months that followed, the destruction of Japan's merchant fleet reshaped the final phase of the Pacific War. By spring 1945, American submarines were operating almost without opposition. Patrol reports read like ledgers of ruin. Lists of ships sunk, convoys shattered, tonnage recorded with cold precision. Even small coastal vessels and fishing boats became targets. Japan's desperation had reduced its logistics to whatever could still float. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, whose leadership had transformed the silent service, understood the magnitude of what his men had accomplished. He later reflected, "We had strangled the Japanese economy. It was the most effective blockade in history." His submariners had accounted for less than 2% of the U.S. Navy's manpower, yet they were responsible for destroying more than half of Japan's maritime losses. The cost, however, was heavy. 52 American submarines and over 3,500 crewmen never returned. Many vanished without a trace, entombed at the bottom of the Pacific. In places like the Luzon Strait and the East China Sea, their wrecks still rest, silent memorials to a war fought in darkness. When Japan finally surrendered on August 15, 1945, its defeat was more than military. The empire's economic arteries had been cut months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Submarine warfare had made it impossible to sustain the fight. Fuel reserves had fallen to less than 6 million barrels, barely enough for a few weeks of naval operations. Civilian shipping was down to a fraction of pre-war capacity. Even the Imperial household's own trains were being pulled by oxen. The Americans who emerged from the sea at war's end were not celebrated like fighter aces or carrier captains. Their victories had no cheering crowds, no grand parades. Yet, in strategic terms, they had accomplished what massive fleets and entire armies could not. They had collapsed an empire by starving it from beneath the waves. The Silent War was over, but its legacy would echo through naval history for generations. When historians look back at the Pacific War, it is often the thunder of carrier battles and the blinding light of atomic fire that dominate the memory. But in truth, Japan's defeat began quietly, deep beneath the surface, in the cold black silence of the Pacific. The U.S. submarine campaign was not born of spectacle, but of persistence. It was a war fought in confined steel compartments, by men who lived without sunlight, who measured time by sonar pings and the ticking of valves. Their victories came not through numbers of enemies killed, but through the slow suffocation of an empire's heartbeat, its supply lines. By 1945, Japan had become a nation surrounded by water, yet starved by it. Its vast conquests in Asia were meaningless without the oil and steel to sustain them. The empire that once sought to dominate the Pacific was brought to its knees not by a single battle, but by the accumulation of thousands of unseen strikes. Each sinking, each convoy lost, was another pulse fading from its body. The lesson endures. Wars are not won solely by the clash of armies or the courage of soldiers. They are decided by those who control movement, who feed their machines, who fuel their fleets, who master the unseen logistics of survival. In that regard, the U.S. Navy's silent service achieved one of the most decisive and efficient victories in modern warfare. When peace finally came, the submariners surfaced into a world that barely knew their names. Their war had left no ruins to tour, no cities in ashes, only coordinates on a map and ships lying in eternal darkness. Yet, it was their quiet, relentless work that ensured Japan's surrender was inevitable long before the bombs fell. The Pacific grew still again, its waters calm and blue, concealing the wrecks of a war that proved one timeless truth. In modern conflict, silence can be deadlier than sound, and patience more powerful than might.